Hello and welcome to Themis Podcasts. Themis is an award-winning platform that helps our clients mitigate and manage their financial crime risk exposure. Our podcasts discuss the current and emerging financial crime threat landscape and bring you thought leadership and interviews from leaders in the field. Find out more at crime.financial.
I'm thrilled to be here today talking with Gavin Miller, a former detective with 30 years' experience in law enforcement, the last 6 of which were spent in the Modern Slavery Human Trafficking Unit for the Police Service of Northern Ireland. Gavin has a real wealth of experience in this area and is now setting up a social enterprise community interest company, highlighting to businesses that modern slavery prevention presents a real opportunity and competitive advantage for them. So I'll start off by asking you, Gavin, if you don't mind, if you can give us a bit more background on your career in modern slavery and human trafficking, just to set the scene for our listeners.
So to give you a little bit of my background, I was 30 years in law enforcement. I spent more than half of that as a detective in the Police Service of Northern Ireland, and I spent the last 6 years of my career as either the operational lead or the deputy operational lead in the Police Service of Northern Ireland, the PSNI, their modern slavery human trafficking unit. And it was by far and away the most enjoyable area of police work I was involved in, for the effect that you could have, the positive effect you could have on people's lives. When you join the police, you join for the reasons that you join for the reasons that you want to help the good people, the vulnerable people, and you want to catch the bad guys. And there's nobody more vulnerable than a victim of human trafficking, and there's no one who is more callous to humanity and needs locked up than a trafficker. So the last 6 years were really enjoyable. I was the training lead as well, so delivered the online training for police and police staff. So, and that was completed by over 5,000 people before I left. But because of the partnership, the trafficking was very rewarding and enjoyable work. I don't know if there's any benefit in talking about what human trafficking is.
I think it's really important to get the definitions right. You're right.
So basically, human trafficking is about exploitation. It's mostly about moving somebody from point A to point B, because when they're at point B, you want to exploit them. You want to use them and commodify them for money. That could either be sexual exploitation or labor exploitation, or it could be forced criminality. It's where organized crime gangs make victims commit crime to increase the money flow for the crime gang. Two definitions would be, you also talk about servitude, slavery and servitude, and that's really just when somebody has complete control over your entire life, your work life and your private life. And then the other part would be labor exploitation. What is forced labor? And forced labor is really when somebody is forced to complete work, and there's an area of menace with that makes it forced, that somebody is not doing that voluntarily, they're doing it against their own will. Sometimes I get a bit picky because people and the use of language, I get quite picky because I've been involved in this world, and people talk about smuggling and talk about trafficking and think it's the same thing. They're really very different things. They could be the same routes that the people use to bring to people over to use them, but it's different things. So if you think about human trafficking, then that is somebody being moved to point A to point B because I need you at point B, because that's where I'm going to exploit you. That's where I'm going to use you for money. But when you're talking about, that doesn't have to cross international borders. So if I'm involved as a crime gang, a trafficker involved in sexual exploitation, and I am moving victims from one brothel in Belfast to another brothel in another part of Belfast. That movement is complete. Whereas for smuggling, you need to cross an international border. It's an offence against the state rather than an offence against the person. And smuggling is when there's, usually for social, political, or economic reasons, somebody wants to get from country A to country B, and the smugglers don't care what happens when somebody gets to country B. You see in the TV at night in Dover, all those poor people who are going on the small dinghies and they're crossing over from France into Dover. The smugglers, once they've got the people onto the dinghy and sent them out onto the channel, they don't care what happens to them, which is different from trafficking, because they want to get them to the UK or wherever, because that's the area that you're going to start to exploit. Is that, yeah? So
I wonder if you could also tell us a bit about the specific landscape of modern slavery and human trafficking in Northern Ireland. Are there any particular typologies that you tend to see more of? Does the island's geography or political landscape impact on the specific ways this crime manifests? Or does it present any opportunities even for how you tackle the crime?
An investigation. The PSNI, we were in a really, and are in a really good spot. We've got one of the largest human trafficking unit teams in the United Kingdom, and we have the full support of the police authorities in taking cases forward. Part of the ramifications of being in Northern Ireland is with the Troubles. So it meant that we have a large number of officers who are skilled in not only overt police work, but covert police work. So allowed us to take investigations on, allowed us to take proactive investigations on, and we were good. We had a pride, and still have a pride in what the team would do. That you look sometimes where you're just potentially displacing a problem, just moving it somewhere else. We felt in Northern Ireland, with the skill base that was there, that we were in a really strong position, that we were the best place to take that operation on and take down that organised crime gang. And Northern Ireland was one of the best places that there was for victims. The care and support that they're given through from the Department of Justice and the National Referral Mechanism, down through a large number of fantastic NGOs that work with victims on short-term care, but also the long-term care, that we were in a really good position to take operations forward. We also have an advantage that we're on the little island. Sometimes if you're in Glasgow and you've come across a gang and they maybe move to Manchester, then that moves from Police Scotland to the Greater Manchester Police, or West Midlands, Birmingham to the Met in London. And however well we work together, that's going to cause issues, and it's going to cause gaps. Whereas because in Northern Ireland we're the one policing force, then it gave us that added advantages that we could cover them throughout the entirety of Northern Ireland.
And is it possible to talk through any examples of cases or operations that you've worked on in real life to just give the audience some insight into those?
So the first case I'll talk about is human trafficking by labour exploitation, domestic servitude case. This was a couple that were convicted in this summer for holding a girl in domestic servitude for over a year in Belfast. And the spoiler alert at the start of this story is that one of the convicted suspects worked for a retail bank, a well-known retail bank in Northern Ireland and Belfast, but a UK one of the main big banks. So the reason that I talk about it is because I want to try to instill to people that it's not all foreign nationals. It's not all I have to look at way down the different tiers. The importance of looking at ourselves as our business initially is vital, and not thinking that just because oh, it's somebody who works in a bank, is a UK citizen, makes a good wage, they can't be involved in this. That's not the case. So this was a couple, and they took from their family who had a young girl for 4 years. They took this little girl over, and she had learning disabilities and was a really vulnerable wee girl. And they kept her for over a year, and she was a domestic servant in their house. She was used as just part of the fixtures and fittings of their house. She slept on the floor in a box bedroom with the 2 children. She wasn't given money. She wasn't given phone. She was completely isolated. And because of her vulnerabilities, they used that as part of their control to exploit this young lady. They used immigration status, claiming that they were going to sort out her visa as another control. They held that like a sword of Damocles over this girl, that she felt she was completely trapped and she had nowhere to go. And they stole this girl's life, as well as not paying her any money. And they said that they would pay her family money, but that happened very irregularly. And they did this in full knowledge of what they were doing. There was not as if there was a cultural reason why this was okay. Immigration officers went to speak to them one day and they lied that she wasn't there and she had run away. They knew what they were doing, and what they were doing were just using this girl to make their lives easier, to cook and clean, to look after their children, and allowed them to return to work. Or the lady, she returned to work early, and then it didn't affect her. It didn't affect her salary, maternity, or anything like that at all. So what happened in this case was that there was a big fight one night, and for once they let her walk, and she walked out the house, and she just came across a really kind member of the public who saw her in a distressed state, and she was told her story, and she went to a solicitor, and then she came to the police. And it's one of the cases I'm so proud of, because usually you'll find a victim will just want to go home. They'll want to be repatriated, because where they've been exploited, it doesn't give happy thoughts or memories. As far as court cases go, that can make things really difficult, because somebody's kept in that level of isolation, that it can be really hard to build up a picture of what's happened to this person unless they engage with you. But through the different departments in Northern Ireland and some of the NGO charities and the Department of Justice, the Immigration Service, there's lots of people involved, that she made Northern Ireland, and still has made Northern Ireland, her home. And we're so proud that she's decided to stay. It's absolutely fantastic. But because of that, she felt over time, and it took nearly a year to get her statements of what's happened to her, to build up that level of trust that she could disclose what had happened to her. And with the information that they gave us, then we conducted our investigation.
I'm just going to pause the podcast here to tell you about a newly launched Themis product. The Themis Risk Assessment is an easy-to-use online tool that you can send to all your suppliers and third parties in order for you to gain a holistic view of all your third-party risk in one heat map. It helps you meet your legal and regulatory requirements for outsourcing arrangements. Find out more at crime.financial. Now let's get on with the podcast.
And what sort of help or financial intelligence did you get from banks or other financial institutions that helped you with your investigations?
Another part of the investigation was the help that financial institutions gave us through kind of court productions and the documents that we received. We could show the lifestyle. We could show that what they did was they would put money into her account and then immediately take it back out again, but then we'd have a Photoshop of her account, or they'd put money into her account, but then they would use it to buy things off Amazon or wherever that were nowhere were for any use for her. So this young lady, she had She was told she'd been given a bank card for her money, and it was a bus pass. But she was at a level of vulnerability. She didn't know. She didn't know any better than that. So that's one case that we had, and we're really proud that she's made here and made Northern Ireland her home. We're delighted we got the conviction, and because we got the help from the financial institutions, we were able to show, as I said, that lifestyle, and it meant that the traffickers, the convicted couple, they had to pay her £10,000.
Gosh, that's such an awful story. So the stuff that the banks gave you that helped with that was those kind of the access to those statements and things, so you could kind of yeah,
absolutely. So, and also with that was, we got help from the National Crime Agency, we got help from Nigerian banks and Nigerian law enforcement. So that was really helpful to build up that case, and it meant that it didn't go to trial because we could show that we had so much evidence that it wasn't worth putting that victim through cross-examination and having to appear.
Yeah, that's so important as well, isn't it? Because it's not, as you say, it's not just about the conviction, it's about that victim's experience, and that's something that financial institutions can directly do to help a victim to lessen that.
Absolutely. So another case I'd talk about is, again, this summer was the conviction of a man called Martin Heaney, and he was convicted of the largest human trafficking case for sexual exploitation on the island of Ireland under the new legislation. And it came about because of a suspicious activity report. It came about because the financial institution had recognised his accounts and how much money he was meant to have coming into his account to the actual vast amount of money that was flowing through his accounts, and they raised a suspicious activity report. So that then gets sent to the police team, and that helps to initiate. In this case of Martin Heaney, he identified and picked on really young, vulnerable women who were all local, all from Northern Ireland, and he exploited their vulnerability for sexual exploitation. And he did that for his own gain, and he did that for other people's gains. He would drive these girls all around Ireland, the whole island of Ireland, and he would use them to be sexually exploited. And in Northern Ireland, paying for sexual service is a crime. It's only part of the UK where that legislation is in place at the moment, called the Nordic model.
So just as a brief interlude here, I'd like to explain to listeners what the Nordic model is, in case you're not familiar with it. Its full name is the Nordic model approach to prostitution. It's also sometimes referred to as the Swedish model, or the end demand model, or partial decriminalisation. And under this model, buyers or clients of sex services are criminalised, while the sex workers themselves are decriminalised. Their activities like third-party advertising, pimping, owning a brothel, etc., are still illegal. But the objective of the model is really to decrease the demand for prostitution and thereby decrease the volume of the industry overall. It was developed also as part of Sweden's Violence Against Women Act. So you can see that the model is sort of aims that sex workers who may be trafficking victims aren't punished for prostitution. The European Parliament passed a non-binding resolution urging member states to adopt the model, which criminalises the purchase of prostitution but offers support for trafficking victims to exit the sex trade. And it has been adopted in a few countries around the world, including Ireland and Northern Ireland.
He would travel all over, and he would make vast sums of money, which he would then use for his own gain. And because the banking officials could see that money trail, the amount that he was paying for fuel, the amount he was paying for adult service website ads and creating these things, then they used that to help educate and inform us. And so once we started to look at this man, we could build up the pillars of our operation, which involves travel. Financial is a huge part to play. And then we could start to engage with the victims. And we worked really closely to build up a trusting relationship with the victims, that they stayed on board with us, because some of them had really bad experiences with law enforcement, were very nervous and very scared. And that's one of the reasons that he identified them and he picked on them. But we got a result at court, and he was convicted of 29 separate offences, 12 separate females victims he had exploited, and 10 of those victims had been for human trafficking, for sexual exploitation. So he was convicted, and he was given a special order called a Slavery and Trafficking Prevention Order, which monitors his behaviour when he's released from prison, which he's breached already.
Oh, God. Suspicious activity report that the bank submitted, was that about the adult service websites and the amount?
Yeah, that was it. So it was him. It was just clearly showing that somebody who was meant to be retired, having a very minimal pension, had a very large amount of cash flowing through his accounts and what it was paying for. So that was a really fantastic case for us, because without the involvement of the financial institution, we might have picked up on that at some stage, but we picked up earlier than we would have. And not only is it great to get the conviction, but it's what it gives to the victims. Yeah, and then hopefully there'll be some financial recompense for them. But it's more than that. It's more a feeling of legitimacy and a feeling of self-worth. And it was wrong what this man had done to them. And again, I can't comment highly enough on the NGOs and the different partners and the prosecution service, who all played a really big part in getting this over the line and getting him prosecuted.
Yeah, so that's a kind of a good example, I guess, of a cross-sector partnership. And is that how a lot of your cases work, with kind of input from all of those?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So part of the involvement will be the Department of Justice. It'll be the prosecution service. If in this case he took victims down to the Republic of Ireland, so our colleagues in the Garda Síochána, we have a close relationship with them. So everybody comes together and helps each other. So I talk about just the importance of partnership and the value of partnership.
Well, thank you very much for your time today, Gavin. It's been fascinating, a really great introduction to some of the landscape in Northern Ireland and some of the cases you've worked on, and really helped to prosecute as well. It's not goodbye, though, because this is just the first in a series of podcasts that we're recording with Gavin. We're really mining him for all his worth, because he's got so many fascinating stories to tell. So we will speak to you soon, Gavin. And listeners, you can look out for the second podcast in this series, which will be coming soon.
Thank you so much for joining us for this edition of Themis Podcasts. Find out more about Themis at crime.financial.